The breakthrough. Amelia Simmons had always been a woman of determination. From a young age, she had understood the weight of persistence. Growing up, there were no silver spoons handed to her. Her mother, Linda Simmons, had raised her single-handedly, juggling multiple jobs to provide for them after a devastating accident took the life of Amelia's father. They were a team, just the two of them. Amelia had spent her childhood in the small town of Willow Creek, learning that hard work and resilience were the keys to survival. Her mother's sacrifice had shaped Amelia's worldview. Linda had always told her, if you want something, work for it. No one's going to hand it to you. Those words echoed in Amelia's mind as she pored over job listings in the city. After countless interviews and rejections, she had finally secured an interview with Darnell Enterprises, one of the leading firms in the corporate world. It was her dream job, an opportunity to build a career while helping her mother get the medical care she desperately needed after her accident a few years ago. The day she was called in for her second interview, Amelia had been on cloud nine. She had fought for this moment. The endless days spent writing resumes, rehearsing responses, and staying up late working on her skills had paid off. Her dream was within reach. Christian Darnell, the CEO of the company, was known for his charming demeanor and his sharp business acumen. The stories that circulated about him painted a picture of a man who could close any deal with ease, but also one who valued loyalty and dedication in his employees. Amelia had heard about him through her network. He was successful, ambitious, and, as some colleagues described, relatable. He didn't come off as the typical corporate shark. This made him all the more appealing to Amelia, who had always admired powerful, yet approachable leaders. The morning of her second interview, Amelia put on her best suit, navy blue, professional, and modest. She reviewed the company's annual report one last time while waiting in the lobby of Darnell Enterprises. Her nerves were on edge, but she could feel the steady pulse of her heartbeat in her chest as she awaited her chance to shine. The interview had gone well, she thought, as she walked out of the building with a mixture of optimism and caution. There was still a small voice in her head telling her to not get ahead of herself. After all, she had been rejected so many times before. Later that afternoon, Amelia's phone buzzed with an unknown number. "Hello?" she answered, already feeling a flutter of anxiety. "Amelia Simmons? This is Christian Darnell, CEO of Darnell Enterprises. I wanted to personally offer you the position of junior executive in our communications department. You were our top candidate, and we'd love for you to join our team." Amelia felt the weight of those words settle in. She had done it. She had finally made it. Her heart raced as she could hardly contain her excitement. "Thank you, Mr. Darnell. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," he replied with a chuckle. "We'll have the details sorted out soon. I'll see you on your first day." When Amelia hung up, she couldn't stop smiling. Her first official step toward independence had been taken. More than that, it was the first time she truly felt like she could make a difference, not only in her own life but also in her mother's. This job was a lifeline for both of them. Amelia envisioned the future, her mother's health improving, their financial struggles alleviated, and a sense of accomplishment that had long eluded her. But Amelia could never have predicted how quickly her world would shift. The next morning, she arrived early for her first day at Darnell Enterprises, nerves tangled with excitement. The towering skyscraper felt intimidating, yet welcoming in a strange way. Amelia took a deep breath as she entered the sleek, modern lobby, the sound of her heels echoing against the polished floors. Her first impressions were everything she had hoped for. The office was immaculate, with an open-plan design that allowed for collaboration and innovation. Friendly faces greeted her as she was led to her desk, her new colleagues offering words of encouragement and congratulations. She couldn't believe it, her dream job had started, and it felt like everything was falling into place. However, as the hours ticked by, Amelia began to notice something peculiar about Christian Darnell. While he had been charming and friendly during the interview, something about his demeanor was starting to feel off. He walked past her desk a few times, offering a brief smile, but there was a strange intensity behind his gaze. Amelia chalked it up to him being busy and perhaps slightly aloof, as many CEOs often were. But the feeling persisted, and she couldn't shake it. By mid-afternoon, Christian had invited her into his office. "Amelia, come in. I'd like to have a word with you," he said with a tone that was almost too casual. She nodded and walked into his office, which was even more impressive than she had imagined. The room had an air of power, with dark mahogany furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning view of the city. Once inside, Christian gestured for her to sit. "I've been looking over your credentials, and I think you're going to fit in here just fine. But I also wanted to get a feel for how you handle yourself in the field. Tomorrow, you'll be attending an important client meeting with me. It'll be a great way to get your feet wet." Amelia smiled, trying to hide the thrill in her chest. "Thank you, Mr. Darnell. I appreciate the opportunity." Christian leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers. "I think you'll do well. You're smart, driven, and capable. But remember, we expect the best from everyone who works here. Excellence is the only thing that's acceptable." His words felt heavier than they should have. But Amelia dismissed the feeling. He was just being a perfectionist, right? "I'll do my best," Amelia replied, trying to keep her voice steady. As the conversation continued, there were moments when Christian's tone shifted. His compliments, while sincere on the surface, began to feel like tests, like he was scrutinizing every aspect of her demeanor. She tried to ignore the feeling, focusing instead on the opportunity in front of her. Little did Amelia know that this seemingly perfect job was about to take a dark turn, testing her in ways she never could have imagined. The unsettling shift. Amelia had always prided herself on her ability to read people. It was a skill she had honed over years of listening carefully to others, observing their actions, and reading between the lines. However, even her sharp instincts couldn't quite prepare her for what was to come. Christian Darnell, the powerful CEO she had admired from afar, began to display subtle but unmistakable signs of behavior that made her feel increasingly uncomfortable. The first incident occurred just a day after their meeting in his office. Amelia had been tasked with preparing a presentation for an upcoming client, something she had worked tirelessly on the night before. She wanted to impress not only the clients but also her boss. It was the kind of challenge she thrived on, and she poured her heart into every detail, from the formatting to the content, ensuring everything was flawless. When she walked into Christian's office that morning to present her work, she felt the weight of anticipation hanging in the air. Christian sat behind his large desk, his sharp gaze piercing through her as she approached. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure if she could shake off the odd feeling that had been lingering since their last conversation. But she pushed it aside. This was her chance to prove herself. "I've completed the client presentation," Amelia said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "I've ensured that it aligns with the goals we discussed." Christian didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood up and walked toward her, his presence feeling almost predatory. She stood still, trying to ignore the sense of discomfort that prickled up her spine. Christian's eyes were locked on her as he took the presentation from her hands and glanced over the first few slides. His lips curved into a thin, unamused smile as he made a quick assessment. "You're missing a few key points," he said, his voice calm but somehow dripping with a condescending tone. "This isn't good enough. You'll need to revise it." Amelia's chest tightened, but she bit her lip and nodded. She could handle criticism. She had heard it before, from professors, from past employers, and from clients. But something about his words felt off, too dismissive, almost like a deliberate attempt to belittle her. She had worked hard on this presentation, but Christian's icy demeanor seemed to strip away any recognition of her effort. As she turned to leave his office, she could feel his eyes on her. She could sense that his gaze was lingering a moment too long, making her skin crawl. The second incident came soon after, a small but unsettling change in Christian's behavior. It started with little things, a comment here, a glance there, that would have easily gone unnoticed by anyone else. For example, when she was sitting at her desk one afternoon, working on a report, Christian passed by and briefly stopped by her workstation. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You look different today," he said, his voice warm but with a strange edge. "More confident. It suits you." Amelia forced a smile in response, unsure how to react. She could tell there was something more to his words, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. The comment felt almost too personal, as though he had crossed a boundary. She immediately focused on her work, trying to brush off the unsettling feeling. But it didn't stop there. Over the next few days, Christian began making a series of increasingly inappropriate comments. On one occasion, while they were discussing a new marketing strategy in the break room, he casually leaned over her shoulder, his breath too close to her ear. "You're a hard worker, Amelia. It's rare to find someone so dedicated. Maybe if you worked with me a little more closely, we could make things even better." The implication behind his words was clear. Amelia stiffened, her eyes narrowing as she pulled away from him, trying to maintain a professional distance. She wasn't imagining it, Christian's actions were becoming more invasive, his compliments more suggestive. She confronted her feelings of discomfort the moment she returned to her desk, but she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Something was wrong. Christian, the man who had seemed so approachable, so polished during the interview, was revealing a much darker side. Yet, she refused to let it get to her. Amelia was strong. She had learned to push through discomfort for the sake of survival. Her mother needed her, and she couldn't afford to let anything distract her from her goal. Her dream job was right in front of her, and she couldn't risk losing it, not now. But then came the turning point, when things escalated, and Amelia realized just how far Christian was willing to go. It happened on the second week of her employment, when she was asked to stay late in the office to finish some last-minute preparations for an important meeting the next morning. Amelia agreed without hesitation, knowing that she had the opportunity to prove herself. The office was almost empty, the building quiet except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. As the minutes ticked by, she focused on her work, determined to finish her task. It was only when she heard the distinct sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway that she looked up from her desk. Christian appeared in the doorway, his silhouette casting a long shadow across the room. He smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Amelia, still working hard, I see." She nodded, trying to maintain her professionalism. "Yes, I'm just finishing up the presentation for tomorrow's meeting." He stepped into the room, slowly closing the door behind him. His movements felt deliberate, almost as if he were encroaching on her space. Amelia couldn't help but notice the change in his posture, his body language had shifted, and it was more imposing now. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. "Good. You know," Christian said, his voice lowering, "hard work like yours deserves to be rewarded." His gaze dropped to her hands, lingering there for a moment longer than necessary. Amelia's stomach tightened, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She had never felt more exposed. She quickly stood up, trying to put some distance between them. "I think I've got it covered, Mr. Darnell," she said, her voice firm but with an undercurrent of unease. Christian took a step closer, his expression shifting into something darker. "You know, Amelia, I'm a man who appreciates talent. It's a shame that you don't realize your full potential yet." He reached out, his hand brushing a strand of hair from her face in a motion that was far too familiar, too intimate. Her heart raced, and a cold sweat broke out across her brow. She instinctively stepped back, knocking into her desk in the process. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Christian smiled, a slow, calculated smile that didn't match the warmth of his previous demeanor. "I think you do." With every word, the air between them grew thicker. Amelia's mind raced as she considered her options. She had never been in a situation like this before. What was she supposed to do? But before she could react, Christian's phone rang, cutting the tension abruptly. "Excuse me," he said, his voice suddenly back to its usual detached tone. "I'll have to take this." Amelia didn't wait for him to finish the call. She quickly grabbed her things and left the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't escape the feeling that something terrible was unfolding. This was no longer just a job. It had become a minefield, and she was walking on fragile ground. The unseen threat. The next few days at Darnell Enterprises were a blur of uncertainty for Amelia. Every time she walked into the office, her stomach twisted in knots, and she found herself scanning the room for Christian. His presence, once charming and charismatic, had begun to feel like a looming shadow. She couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that clung to her, no matter how much she tried to focus on her work. The lingering discomfort from her last encounter in his office had left her on edge, and now, the office, once a symbol of her hard-earned success, felt like a place of quiet danger. Despite the unease she felt, Amelia continued to give her all. She worked tirelessly on the projects assigned to her, pushing through her discomfort to maintain her professionalism. She kept her head down, hoping that the distance between herself and Christian would shield her from any further advances. But that hope was short-lived. It had been 2 days since the incident in his office, and Amelia was trying to focus on a report when she heard the sound of footsteps approaching her desk. Her heart skipped a beat as she looked up to see Christian standing before her. This time, his expression was different. He wasn't smiling, but there was an intensity in his eyes that made her stomach flip. "Amelia," he said, his voice low but steady. "I need you in my office. Now." The words felt like a command more than a request. His tone brooked no argument, and his gaze was unwavering. Amelia froze for a moment, uncertainty flooding her mind. She had been hoping to avoid him for as long as possible, but now there was no escaping it. She stood up slowly, trying to mask the fear rising in her chest, and walked toward his office. As she entered, Christian closed the door behind her with an unusual force, the sound of the latch clicking shut making her pulse quicken. He was standing at his desk, flipping through papers, but when she stepped into the room, he turned toward her with a tight smile. "You're doing well with the work, Amelia," he said, his voice not quite matching the compliment. "But there's something you're missing." She hesitated, unsure what he was referring to. "I don't understand, Mr. Darnell. Is there something wrong with the report?" "No," he replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. "It's not the report, it's you. I've been watching you, and I can't help but notice how reserved you've become lately." Amelia's pulse hammered in her ears as she tried to maintain her composure. She was fully aware of the insinuation in his words. He was calling attention to her discomfort, to the distance she had put between them. The distance that, until now, had been her shield. "I'm just focused on my work, Mr. Darnell," she replied, keeping her voice as steady as possible. "I'm here to do my job." Christian took a step closer, the air between them thickening with tension. "Your job," he repeated, his eyes scanning her face, "isn't just about the work, Amelia. It's about how you fit into the bigger picture here. I think you need to learn how to integrate better, to become part of the team, my team." His words were heavy with an unspoken challenge, and they sent a chill down her spine. His proximity was suffocating, his gaze now resting on her in a way that felt far too intimate, too intrusive. She instinctively took a step back, her throat tight as she tried to keep her voice calm. "I'm doing my best to learn and contribute," she said, her words measured but firm. I've only been here for a short time. I'm still adjusting. Christian didn't immediately respond. Instead, he stepped around his desk and stood directly in front of her, blocking her escape route. For a moment, his silence stretched on, making the room feel impossibly small. Amelia's mind raced, her thoughts a frantic whirlwind of what to say or do. She couldn't afford to let him see her panic. Then, with an unsettling calmness, Christian spoke again. You're underestimating the value of this opportunity, Amelia. This company is built on trust, on relationships. And relationships need to be nurtured. Amelia's heart pounded as his words settled over her like a heavy weight. She knew exactly what he was implying, and she could feel the walls of the office closing in around her. Every instinct in her told her to leave, to get out of that room before things took a darker turn. But something else inside her, a fierce, protective voice, urged her to stay strong. She couldn't let him intimidate her. I understand the importance of relationships, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor she could feel in her hands. But I'm here to work, not to engage in anything else. Christian's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Of course. But remember, Amelia, sometimes work and personal connections are intertwined. You'll learn that soon enough. The words stung more than she wanted to admit, but she refused to show any vulnerability. She straightened her back, meeting his gaze head-on. I'm committed to this company and my role here, Mr. Darnell. Nothing will change that. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of something in Christian's eyes. Was it irritation? Disappointment? It was hard to tell. But the tension between them remained thick, charged with an uncomfortable energy that made Amelia want to run. I'm sure you are, he said softly, his voice turning almost soothing. Just don't forget that opportunities come in many forms. And with that, he turned away, dismissing her with a casual wave of his hand. You can go back to your work now, Amelia. We'll talk again soon. Amelia wasted no time in leaving his office. She didn't wait for him to speak again, didn't dare to stay in his presence for a moment longer than necessary. As she stepped back into the open office area, her pulse still racing, she couldn't help but wonder how much longer she could continue to ignore the rising sense of danger that was becoming impossible to ignore. A growing resolve. Days turned into weeks, and though Amelia had hoped for things to return to normal, she quickly realized that her interactions with Christian were only getting more complicated and uncomfortable. The once distant but professional relationship they had shared had devolved into something insidious. Each encounter left her feeling more alienated and vulnerable, but something inside her refused to break. She could still see the bigger picture, her mother's care, her own dreams, and she held on to those things tightly, as though they were the only lifeline left. Christian's advances, though subtle, had become more persistent. His comments had shifted from professional critique to veiled insinuations. There were moments when Amelia would find herself in meetings with him, where the words he spoke weren't about the work at all. He would gaze at her intently, making small talk about her personal life, pushing boundaries under the guise of curiosity. When she would deflect the conversation back to business, he'd quickly change the subject, but not without leaving a lingering discomfort in the air. It was on a late Thursday afternoon when everything changed. Amelia had been working on a new proposal for an important client, her head down, her fingers typing furiously across her keyboard. The office had emptied out for the day, and she was alone in the quiet space, focused on finishing the task at hand. Her concentration was shattered when Christian suddenly appeared at her desk. His face was unreadable, and for the first time, Amelia felt the full weight of his presence before he even spoke. Amelia, he said, his voice carrying an unfamiliar edge. I need you to come with me. She looked up from her work, startled. There was something in his eyes, something dark, that made her hesitate for a fraction of a second. Her heartbeat quickened as she instinctively recognized the shift in the atmosphere. I still have some work to finish, Mr. Darnell, she said, trying to maintain her composure, though a tight knot had formed in her stomach. Christian's expression didn't change. "This will only take a moment." With that, he turned and began to walk down the hallway, expecting her to follow. Amelia's mind raced, her feet frozen in place for just a moment longer. There were so many reasons to refuse him, so many instincts telling her to stay behind, to protect herself. But then, the thought of her mother, her hospital bills, surged forward in her mind. This job, this opportunity, was a lifeline. She took a deep breath and reluctantly followed Christian down the corridor to his private office. As they walked, she couldn't help but notice the way he kept glancing over his shoulder at her. It was as if he were savoring her discomfort, watching her reaction to his power. When they reached his office, Christian stepped inside and held the door open for her, ushering her in with a sharp gesture. The room felt smaller now, oppressive even, as though the very air had changed. Amelia's breath hitched as she stepped in, instinctively taking a few steps back from him. "Please, have a seat," he said smoothly, though there was no warmth in his voice. His eyes lingered on her, unblinking, as if sizing her up. Amelia's mind raced. Every part of her wanted to leave, to bolt from this room, but she held her ground. She'd come this far. She couldn't let him see how afraid she was. She straightened her shoulders and tried to remain calm. "I'd prefer to stand," she said, her voice colder than she had intended. Her body was tense, ready for any sudden movement, but she refused to show weakness. She had dealt with tough situations before, she could do this. Christian didn't seem surprised by her response. Instead, his lips curled into a tight, almost predatory smile. "You know, Amelia, you're a very hard woman to figure out. So strong, so determined. But I wonder, beneath all that, what do you really want?" Her heart hammered in her chest, and she felt her throat tighten. The way he spoke made it sound as if he were dissecting her, breaking her down piece by piece. "I want to do my job," she replied firmly. "I'm here to work, Mr. Darnell. Nothing more." Christian moved a step closer, but Amelia remained resolute, standing her ground. "Of course. I understand. But sometimes, work isn't the only thing that matters, is it?" His voice was now lower, more intimate, and it sent a shiver down her spine. He reached for a file on his desk and handed it to her. "This proposal. It's almost good, but it's lacking in a few key areas. Maybe we can work on it together, over dinner? I'm sure we'll have plenty to discuss." Amelia took the file, her hand slightly shaking, but she kept her face neutral. Dinner. The suggestion made her stomach churn, but she knew she had to be careful, to navigate the situation without giving anything away. She forced herself to look at him, meeting his eyes without flinching. "I think I can finish it on my own, Mr. Darnell," she said, her voice as firm as she could make it. "I'm perfectly capable of completing the proposal." Christian studied her for a moment, and for a moment, Amelia thought he might push the issue further. But instead, he just smiled again, that same predatory smile. "Very well," he said with a casual shrug. "But remember, Amelia, you don't have to do everything alone. You're here to be part of the team, to collaborate." The double meaning behind his words was clear, and Amelia felt her skin crawl. He was testing her, pushing her boundaries further with each passing moment. But she wasn't going to let him see how rattled she was. "Thank you for the offer, but I'll finish the work myself. I appreciate your time." She turned on her heel and walked swiftly out of the room, not looking back. As she made her way down the hall, her thoughts were a chaotic whirlpool of emotions. She had narrowly escaped the situation, but she knew this was only the beginning. Christian was relentless, and the more she refused him, the more dangerous he would become. She couldn't let him win. She couldn't let herself be intimidated into silence. But the truth was, she didn't know how long she could keep up the act. Every encounter with Christian left her feeling more trapped, and the pressure was beginning to build. Later that night, when Amelia sat at her desk at home, the harsh glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows on her papers, she found herself contemplating the future. Her mother's medical bills were still piling up, and there were moments when the weight of everything, her job, her mother's care, her own fear, felt unbearable. But one thing was certain, she would never let Christian break her. No matter what it took, she would find a way to hold on to her dignity and her strength. She couldn't afford to lose herself now. The breaking point. Amelia's days at Darnell Enterprises had become a battleground, though the enemy was never fully visible. It was a quiet war, one fought in the corners of the office, in the whispers between the lines of her reports, and most of all, in her own mind. Every move she made was calculated, each glance at Christian a reminder of the danger lurking beneath the polished surface of his persona. His subtle manipulations and insinuations had grown bolder, but Amelia, though shaken, remained resolute. Her mother needed her, and she couldn't afford to lose everything now. The pressure of the job had been weighing heavily on her. She had been working late most nights, often alone in the office, when the rest of the staff had gone home. She would push herself, staying up late into the night, as if working harder could shield her from the tension that had slowly built between her and Christian. But even in the relative quiet of her work, she couldn't escape the feeling that something dark was unfolding. It was during one of these late nights, when she was hunched over her desk, revising a report for the third time, that the phone rang. The shrill sound echoed through the empty office, startling her. She picked it up quickly, expecting to hear the voice of one of her colleagues or maybe her mother's hospital staff checking in on the payments. But the voice on the other end was unexpected, too familiar, and for the first time, it was completely out of place. "Amelia, I need to talk to you." The voice was Christian's. Amelia's stomach sank. She had been dreading this moment, but now it had arrived with the force of a storm, crashing over her. His voice was soft but insistent, like a hand on her shoulder, warm, yet suffocating. "I'm a little busy, Mr. Darnell," she said, trying to keep her tone neutral, the shaking in her voice disguised as exhaustion. "Busy working, or busy avoiding me?" His voice shifted slightly, a playful undertone now present, but there was no mistaking the tension behind his words. "I think we need to have that dinner. I've been waiting for you to accept, Amelia. You can't keep dodging me forever." She felt her body stiffen, her hands gripping the phone tightly, as if the plastic was the only thing keeping her grounded. Dinner. That invitation had been lingering in her mind for days now, like a dark cloud she couldn't escape. She had avoided him at every turn, but it seemed her ability to maintain distance was running out. "I don't think dinner is necessary, Mr. Darnell," she said, her voice firm despite the trepidation gnawing at her. "I'm just here to do my job. I've told you this before." The silence on the other end was unnerving. For a moment, it seemed as if he had accepted her response, but then he spoke again, and his voice had taken on a darker edge. "You don't understand, Amelia," he said slowly. "This is about more than just your job. You're making things harder than they need to be. I'm trying to help you here. I'm offering you something, and you're rejecting it. Don't you want to succeed? Don't you want to be part of something more than just a small desk in the corner?" Her breath hitched. He was trying to manipulate her, using her ambition, her desire for success, as leverage to wear her down. But Amelia wasn't foolish. She had seen the game he was playing from the beginning. He was trying to control her, to push her into a corner where she had no choice but to submit. And now, his words felt like a trap. Every offer he made, every suggestion, every compliment was a thread pulling her towards something she couldn't escape. "I'm not interested in anything more than what I've already told you," Amelia said, her voice a little stronger now. "I'm here to work. That's all I want." There was another pause, longer this time, and Amelia could feel the weight of his silence pressing on her chest. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost threatening. "You'll regret this, Amelia. I'm trying to help you, but if you want to keep playing hard to get, that's fine. Just know that I'm not someone you want to make an enemy of." His words were chilling. The threat was clear, and for a moment, the air felt thick, like the room was closing in around her. She had heard of people like him before, people who wielded their power like a weapon, using fear and manipulation to bend others to their will. Amelia wasn't naive. She knew the stakes. She hung up the phone before he could say another word. Her heart was racing, her hands trembling. She had faced him head-on, but the reality of what she was dealing with settled heavily in her mind. Christian wasn't just a man with power, he was dangerous. And Amelia realized, for the first time, that she couldn't keep dodging him. She couldn't keep working in the shadows, hoping the situation would somehow resolve itself. But as she sat in the office that night, a new determination began to take root. She couldn't afford to be passive any longer. If she wanted to protect herself, protect her future, and protect her mother, she had to take control. The next morning, she arrived early, before anyone else had arrived at the office. She walked past Christian's office, her mind set on one thing, freedom. She had made her decision. She would take the situation into her own hands. Christian was already in his office when she walked by, but this time, Amelia didn't stop. She didn't flinch when she heard his voice call after her. "Amelia, wait." This time, she kept walking. She didn't need his approval, his validation, or his twisted idea of mentorship. She had something far more important to fight for, her own integrity and the future she was building for herself and her mother. But Amelia knew that the hardest part was yet to come. Christian would not let go of his pursuit so easily. The battle had only just begun, and it was up to her to make the next move.